Let me paint a picture for you. The year is 2035 and AI is everywhere. Well, we don't have to worry about robots rising up and killing humans, except for Tesla's self-driving feature, which has somehow only gotten better at steering into parked cars. Still, things have changed drastically. Spam has evolved from poorly written emails in your junk mail folder to sophisticated scams carried out by bots that are often indistinguishable from real people. The elderly are especially vulnerable, and the paranoid disconnect from reality this causes, combined with the effects of old age, cause a new mental health crisis. Even the young and tech-savvy aren't immune to this, though, as shared reality has become increasingly susceptible to manipulation. President Beast, now most of the way through his third term in office, is embroiled in a political scandal in which he's accused of having Skibbity Ohio Riz. The T-Series party has moved to impeach, but since their case hinges on a single video of him gooning in the Oval Office, it's thrown out because it's impossible to prove whether or not the video is a deepfake. This sets a terrifying legal precedent, while for the general public, whether or not the video is real hinges entirely on which side of the culture war their social media echo chamber sits on. Social media is now completely overrun with bots to the point where it's now more accurate to assume that anyone you interact with is an AI. The main platforms have all tried to combat this, but there's been no agreed upon solution. Some sites have implemented extreme verification measures, including paid memberships, video calls, and requiring the submission of government-issued ID as well as biometrics, effectively ending anonymity online, but the bots still manage to get through. Other sites have instead fought fire with fire by using AIs of their own for moderation. Rather than outright banning the bots, we'll just come back again. Instead, the mod programs use so-called heaven bans, secretly trapping the bots in a fake site that's inhabited entirely by other AIs. As soon as the existence of these bans becomes known, people begin to theorize that they're also being applied to people, even the prospect of which further stokes mass paranoia. The vast majority of actual online interactions are done in small and extremely closed-off group chats or Discord servers, and even then, there's no way to be completely sure that no bots have infiltrated, and so no personal information is ever shared. Some people do still use the old platforms out of curiosity, necessity, or to avoid the restrictions inherent to bot-free spaces. But in any case, the internet has now become a dead mall. So let's take a deep breath and calm down a little. Well, everything I just described is very much possible, and I think fairly likely. The AI spam bot apocalypse is far from inevitable, and there's a very real chance that the future might not only be okay, but actually good. Just to be clear, the reason I say that isn't because I think that a good future is particularly likely. I don't, but because going into this project, I've been making a conscious effort not to be a doomer about AI. I feel like most of the time when I see this stuff being covered, people will either say that it's completely useless or that it can and soon will do things that are genuinely impossible. I'll be discussing the impact and future of AI more towards the end of this video, but that's not going to be the main focus. Part of that is because I'm not an expert on machine learning and don't want to sound dumb. Also, AI is such a moving target, and I want this video to still be relevant 3 minutes after it's uploaded. Instead, what I find really interesting is that while there are lots of genuinely amazing potential uses for AI, from medical research to better search engines, while all of that stuff is still years away, what we've seen the most is using it to make slop. Right now, every social media site is being flooded with deepfakes of Joe Rogan and Elon Musk shilling even sketchier supplements and meme coins than they usually do, content mills pumping out motivational quotes and Wikipedia movie summaries, and grifters promising to free you from the 9-to-5 wage slavery by teaching you how to dropship or make a faceless YouTube channel. Just logging into Facebook for the first time in years, my feed is made made up of almost entirely AI pages posting pictures of shrimp Jesus, soldiers, and body horror pictures of brown kids. I also love this post I saw that has hashtags like room decor, beautiful home, Avatar 2, Kung Fu Panda 4, and Euro 2024. And then the post just says, is what he's doing right? And then it just shows the scene from The Sopranos where Tony tries to murder his mother. Damn, wow. I don't know. Much to think about. This is affecting parts of the internet that people actually use too, though. Google is increasingly becoming useless, especially if you're trying to research a product that you want to buy. Typing Reddit at the end of your search worked for a minute, but now bots are just taking over Reddit pages too. And then there's Twitter, where something I loved about the site was that the best part of any viral tweet used to be reading the replies, which were usually way funnier than the original post. Now though, anytime a post gets any traction, all of the replies are just porn bots posting whole or else blue check engagement farms. It also used to be a pretty good place to get news. Like, I'll talk about this more later, but despite Twitter being an echo chamber, there are so many journalists on there that you could easily follow any news story as it developed. Now, if you look at any trending topic though, it's just shit like 10 celebrities who've met Chappell Roan. Which brings me to this video's sponsor. So, one of the many casualties of the flood of bots, sponsored posts, misleading headlines, and fake mobile game ads is that it's becoming increasingly difficult to find any nuggets of nuanced and factual reporting. Fucking fly. That's where Ground News comes in. It's an independent and ad-free platform that gathers related articles from more than 50,000 sources around the world in one place and allows you to compare how different outlets cover the same story. On their app and website, every story comes with a clear breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the reporting sources, backed up by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. Thanks to them, I've been able to unplug from being drip-fed a stream of articles engineered in a lab to make me doom scroll, and instead, I'm drinking from a clear glacial spring of articles that help me be doom informed. I'm sorry, there's a lot of bad stuff going on, so it's pretty hard to get away from having at least some doom in your news diet. We get it, you're a subway. Shut up. Although, here's some actual good news. The FTC just banned companies from buying, selling, or AI-generating fake online reviews. Ground News found 30 sources reporting this, but if you're one of the 10 conservatives who watch me in order to give yourselves an aneurysm, you may have missed this story, since of the outlets that covered this, only 11% were conservative. In the case of the FTC ban, we can see that Business Insider talks more about the background of how brands and influencers buy fake reviews, whereas if you look at coverage on the other side of the political spectrum, Breitbart instead focuses more on just the specifics of what the law can and can't do. Anyway, hopefully the FTC will actually be good about enforcing this, but that is genuinely sick news. I've been using Ground News for the last couple months and find them really useful. For one thing, I can follow all of my favorite outlets in one place. These tend to do a lot of great reporting, but don't show up as much on my social media feed. There's also their blind spot feature though, which shows me stuff that's covered by sources on the other side of the political spectrum that I normally miss. So go to ground.news/we're in hell, use the link in the description, or just scan this here QR code like you're living in the goddamn future to get 40% off of their unlimited Vantage plan, which you can use to get unlimited access to all of their features. All this relates to dead internet theory, a term that's now used to describe the present-day state of the internet, which is rapidly approaching the situation I described earlier. But the thing is that when most people talk about this theory, they tend to sort of gloss over its origin as a deranged 4chan conspiracy theory that later gained traction after being picked up by a vaporwave forum. I understand it might be hard to take seriously something with the same trajectory as Nazi synth pop, but stick with me here. The theory states that the internet has been taken over completely by AI bots to the point where, while the web isn't empty, the bots outnumber us something like 1,000 to 1. While there may still be some small sections of the net, like Discord servers or group chats, where you can still talk to real people, Basically, anytime you see someone on any mainstream site, there's a high likelihood that they're AI generated. But the part of this that I find most interesting is the timeline. The theory was first posted back in 2020 and claims that the internet died in 2016. There's kind of a thing where any technology seems like it was inevitable after it comes out, but if we go back a couple of years, no one really thought AI would look like LLMs back in 2020, let alone 2016. Like, just looking at any articles about AI written in that time period, most people were just talking about like self-driving cars, not chatbots or image generators. And so it's kind of wild that the theory actually managed to nail it. Obviously, there's some survivorship bias going on there since we don't remember all of the theories that were completely off. But the reason I bring all this up isn't because I think Anon is a psychic, but because I think that there's an important link between why people thought that the internet died in 2016 and what's going on today. Obviously, this all relates back to a day that I know everyone remembers far too well. Friday, December 22nd, 1989 in Bucharest, the day the Romanian dictator Nicolae Ceausescu's brutal regime came to an end when the military sided with citizens storming the Communist Party headquarters and ousted him. At 2:30 that afternoon, protesters entered the National Television building and interrupted a broadcast to announce that the dictator had fled the capital, encouraging even more citizens to take to the streets. In her essay, Is the Internet Dead?, the artist and theorist Hito Steyerl argues that this moment was the point when images changed from being records or renditions and instead began stepping out of screens and interacting with the world to shape reality. Unlike other events that had unfolded on TV, in this case, the broadcast was the protest, and the instructions they gave caused millions of people to take to the streets, changing world events. For Steyerl, saying that the internet is dead shouldn't be taken to mean that it's disappeared, but that it too has left the screen and spilled out into the world. But how could anyone think it could be over? The internet is now more potent than ever. It has not only sparked but fully captured the imagination, attention, and productivity of more people than at any other point before. Never before have more people been dependent on, embedded into, surveilled by, and exploited by the web. It seems overwhelming, bedazzling, and without immediate alternative. The internet is probably not dead. It has rather gone all out. Or, more precisely, it is all over. By the way, if you've never heard of Hito Steyerl before, check her out. Not only is she a fucking genius, but also everything that she writes sounds like Death Grips lyrics. Just look around you. Artificial islands mimic genetically manipulated plants. Dental offices parade as car commercial film sets. Cheekbones are airbrushed just as whole cities pretend to be YouTube CAD tutorials. Artworks are emailed to pop up in bank lobbies designed on fighter jet software. Huge cloud storage drives rain down as skylines in desert locations. A nail paint clip turns into an Instagram riot. An upload comes down a shitstorm. An anime GIF materializes as a pop-up airport transit gate. In some places, it seems as if entire NSA system architectures were built, but only after Google translating them, creating car lofts where one-way window mirrors face inwards. And so, if all this began in a Romanian TV studio in 1989, it seems pretty fitting then that Dead Internet Theory claims that the internet died in 2016, a year when images were walking off of screens again. From Vine dying as its biggest stars began to be embraced by traditional media, to the police murders of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile erupting out of cell phone cameras and Facebook live streams into streets across America. Meanwhile, the domino chain started in 2011 by an Egyptian Facebook group called We Are All Khaled Saeed, sparking youth-led revolutions across the Arab world, had, by 2016, congealed into a protracted four-way proxy war in Syria. While another Facebook campaign, this time decidedly boomer-led, resulted in the UK stepping out of the European Union 5 months before a 4chan shitpost would step into the Oval Office. I also doubt that it's coincidence that the year people noticed this was 2020, one where this process was reversed when the spread of a virus from Wuhan pushed reality into screens. When we talk about the death of the internet, either the original 4chan theory or the dead mollification that's happening today, I think that the only way to properly understand all of this is as a reaction to and the consequences of a shift that happened, where the purpose of the internet changed. In Nadia Eghbal's book, Working in Public, she writes about the open source software community. There's this sort of utopian idea of open source where everything is egalitarian and things work because a ton of people are all just happy to work together and freely share their passion. In reality, though, most code is bad, especially when it's written by randos with no real skin in the game or barrier to entry. This means that one person or a small team in charge of the project winds up having to sort through all the contributions while maintaining a good relationship with the community on top of actually, working on the project. There's also a sort of weird parasociality that happens to the point where certain parts of the book felt like they could have been written about being a YouTuber. And that's because they kind of were. As Eghbal explained, she chose to focus on open source developers because everything that they do is publicly documented, but the book is really about creators as a whole, since all types of online content creation follow pretty similar patterns. One of those patterns is the tendency for most content to be increasingly made by a very small group of people. If you read reviews on Amazon, you're mostly reading reviews written by people like Grady Harp. If you read Wikipedia, you're mostly reading articles written by people like Justin Knapp. If you watch Twitch streamers, you're mostly watching people like Tyler Bevins. And if you read YouTube comments, you're mostly reading comments written by people like Justin Young. If you consume any content on the internet, you're mostly consuming content created by people who, for some reason, spend most of their time and energy creating content on the internet. And those people clearly differ from the general population in important ways. More succinctly, this is the 90 to 9 to 1 rule, which states that 90% of people on the internet don't contribute anything, 9% contribute a little, and 1% make the vast majority of content. And the thing is that while workers are absolutely nothing new, especially now with the rise of creators, whether on YouTube, Twitch, or GitHub, Eghbal argues that things have changed and that the internet went from being organized like a group of people all sitting in a circle talking to each other to now being more like an audience all looking forward at a stage. Joanne McNeil makes a similar observation in her book Lurking, How a Person Becomes a User, except she presents it in a much more pretentious way, which obviously that's the version I prefer. For McNeil, the internet used to be a place, and now it's become a person. As in, we used to go online or surf the web, and now we ask Google, Reddit, or increasingly ChatGPT. Also, I realize that you're probably thinking how that sounds like a boomer meme about how back in my day a TikTok was a mint. But you are correct, it does sound like that. And also, the analogy I just used is going to be the framing conceit for most of this video, so strap in for that. Not the thing about TikTok being a mint, I mean the part about how, part 1, the internet as a place. You don't have to look very far to find the internet being treated as a place. First of all, the spatial metaphor shows up in basically every retro ISP ad or pop culture depiction of the internet. But this wasn't just limited to old computer manuals or meme-to-hell commercials. The idea of the internet as a sort of physical place existing independent of the laws and limitations of meat space is probably the most enduring theme in tech utopianism, still very much present today with people advocating for a crypto-powered metaverse. The earliest preachers of this were, of course, the sworn enemies of this channel, the hippies. Now, for anyone actually familiar with the countercultural movements of the 60s, this should seem like a bit of an odd pairing, since back then, if you were into radical politics, computers had a very different meaning. The initial protests at Berkeley that would become the free speech movement were actually started in response to the university implementing an automated punch card system for enrolling in classes. By the way, it's so funny how a lot of these protesters would get old and start to call present-day college students a bunch of snowflakes. Like, you spoiled brats are protesting an ongoing genocide? Back in my day, we fought against real issues, like our school using computers. Like, what's next, man? Being made to wear shoes? Barefoot is legal, man. Free your mind and your souls. No, but actually, the protests were tied to the anti-war and civil rights movements. The students came to see their university as a tool for maintaining the status quo, arguing that its function wasn't really to educate young minds, but instead to produce weapons for the war machine and managers for corporate America, all of which is more or less completely true. And the IBM punch card served as a potent metaphor for both. Do not fold, spindle, or mutilate, the instructions given for handling the punch cards became a prominent slogan at those early protests. But this movement was far from a monolith, and so while some people came out of the counterculture interested in fighting for radical political change through organizing, direct action, and being really fucking annoying about how much theory they read, others were hippies. I am painting with a pretty broad brush here, so apologies for harshing anyone's vibes, but that said, a large portion of the hippie movement wasn't interested in engaging with politics through traditional channels, and instead argued that social change should be achieved through personal, spiritual exploration and development. While their counterparts formed political organizations like the Students for a Democratic Society, the hippies instead decided to turn on, tune in, and drop out by getting really into camping, also known as the homesteading/communal living movement. One of these people was Stuart Brand, who began publishing the Whole Earth Catalog, a magazine that was mainly made up of product reviews for things that people needed for homesteading. Except when I say things people needed, this didn't really include many tools or anything like that. Instead, the list was just like books by Buckminster Fuller and Ken Kesey. Just the most insufferable person imaginable. Like, you go on a camping trip with him, and then when you get to the site, he's just like, tents? Oh, I didn't bring those. The only supplies we'll need is a copy of On the Road. Also, while all this was called a catalog, it didn't actually sell any of this stuff. Instead, it just had reviews and then suggestions where people could buy the stuff themselves. Essentially, the Whole Earth Catalog was just LARPy product reviews written by the kind of guy who'd ruin a shrooms trip because he won't stop crying about how much Jordan Peterson has helped him. Now, if that reminds you of anything, it should, because this was insanely influential on the people who go on to make computers and the internet as we know them today. Like, Xerox's original operating system, which Steve Jobs would later steal, was fully copied from the layout for the Whole Earth Catalog. Another person who was inspired by Brand's work and who really ran with cyber-utopianism was Perry Barlow, a lyricist for the Grateful Dead and founder of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, who wrote the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace, where he proclaimed that the web was free from the laws of the physical world, saying, quote, "We are creating a world where anyone, anywhere may express his or her beliefs, no matter how singular, without fear of being coerced into silence or conformity. Your legal concepts of property, expression, identity, movement, and context do not apply to us. They are all based on matter, and there is no matter here." But there were lots of detractors to this way of thinking as well, though. One was a hacker who went by the alias Acid Freak and was particularly annoyed by Barlow's optimism. And so, in response to his manifesto's claims that cyberspace was free from the limitations of the material world, he decided to give Barlow a reality check by hacking him and publishing his credit history. But while the hippies saw cyberspace as their digital commune, others thought of it as the information superhighway, and as that term suggests, they had a much more commercial vision of the internet. For instance, there was AOL, who, if we're going with the highway metaphor, was the internet's first suburb. While other early ISPs had targeted computer enthusiasts, academic institutions, or corporations, AOL was the first to go after regular-ass people. Appropriately, their first office was in a mall in Fairfax, and their then president, Ted Leonsis, had told Wired in 1995 that AOL's target demographic was the kind of people who take a cruise to a foreign country and immediately, quote, run to the Hard Rock Cafe. Now, generally speaking, it's not a great idea for a company to be openly contemptuous of their customers. By the way, join my Patreon, you useless swabs. But Leonsis was probably right not to be too concerned, since the Hard Rock Cafe loving, cruise taking idiots that he was talking about definitely weren't reading Wired magazine in 1995. The people who were reading it were more like the citizens of the foreign country whose shores AOL was dumping cruise ships full of dumb tourists onto, and they weren't happy about it. AOL users were despised by the people of the early internet, as beginning in 1993, their small and extremely nerdy communities were flooded by a massive influx of the least tech-savvy people imaginable. This came to be known as the Eternal September, a reference to how, before companies like AOL, the only time where there'd be an influx of new users was in September, when a fresh crop of first-year comp sci students logged on for the first time. What made this especially bad was that rather than warning people about what they were getting into, or at least asking them to be respectful, AOL essentially presented everything that was on the early web as features of their product that their customers were therefore entitled to, rather than, an already existing community. I mentioned all of this in my video about spam and saw a bunch of comments from people who were around then and are still bitter, and that's very typical. For anyone who was online back before the Eternal September, this will always be AOL's legacy. Now, I think that that's completely fair and deserved, and a terrible thing for AOL to have done to the nerds of yesteryear. But also, it is worth noting how making the internet accessible to normies was good, actually. Please don't come for me because of this, but I'm sorry, I do think that companies like AOL were in part responsible for making the internet a place for people to find recipes and cat videos rather than just Doom mods and Monty Python forums. So now let's get into some of the types of people who are hanging around the early normie accessible internet. While creators as we know them today didn't exist yet, we can see some of the ancestors of modern day clout sharks already carving out evolutionary niches for themselves. One of the most interesting examples of this was lifecasters. These were people like Jennifer Wrigley. Born in 1976 and raised as a nudist, Wrigley developed a pretty relaxed attitude when it came to her privacy. On Sunday, April 14th, 1996, the 19-year-old college junior installed a webcam in her dorm room at Dixon College. She had bought the camera on a whim earlier that week with no real idea what to do with it, and so, being the massive computer nerd that she was, Wrigley decided to give herself a programming challenge where she rigged the camera to take pictures of her room every 15 minutes and upload it to her site, jennycam.org. She originally shared this site with a couple of her friends, but you're never gonna guess what happened. This site, where you could find a constant stream of pictures of this attractive young college student, began getting spread around, and soon, what had started as extra homework she had assigned herself took off as Jennifer Wrigley became the first ever cam girl. Now, when I say cam girl, the term hadn't exactly taken on the sexual connotation it has today. Don't get me wrong though, there very much was a sexual element here, as Wrigley showed herself naked and even had sex on camera, which was obviously a massive part of the appeal, as evidenced by the websites that are still around to this day, where you can find pictures of her naked body, as well as, of course, her feet. But if that's what you were after, it's not like it was hard to find sites that had straight up porn. Plus, on Jennycam, sex or nudity were pretty rare occurrences. Remember that this was a woman whose idea of a fun weekend was coding a website, and so it was way more common to see her studying than making out. And I realize how much this sounds like I'm trying to justify watching a hot tub streamer because I just love the community, but I really think that the popularity of Jennycam points to there being something more going on there. As Wrigley herself said in an interview for Reply All.
I was in my dorm room Saturday night doing laundry. I was not, I was a nerd. And I got an email from someone who said, I'm doing laundry too. And I just looked and I saw that you're doing laundry on Saturday night. It's funny because I felt like a loser. I'm sitting home doing laundry on Saturday night, but I saw you are too. So now I don't feel so bad.
Now, a couple of things. First of all, something I find really interesting with all of this is how At least in my experience, the type of online content that people find the strangest is watching streams. Like, when I talk to my IRL friends, who I swear are real, while they're all like obviously pretty online, although nowhere near as much as I am, all of them watch TikTok and are on Instagram. A few of them watch YouTube videos, or at least they claim to watch mine. But I think that I only know like 2 people who watch Twitch. And like, no offense if you see this, but those guys are weird. And I'm not saying this to throw shots at my friends or streamers. Like, please don't hurt me. No, actually, like, if anything, it's the opposite. I think it's really weird how, to this day, people don't understand the appeal of watching streamers when, literally, that is arguably the oldest kind of video content on the internet. Although, to be fair, that is actually pretty much in line with how people treated internet people back in the 90s, too. At the height of their popularity, Wrigley was interviewed on Letterman, where she was treated more or less the same way you would an exotic animal.
I think the thing is that if you turn on the TV, you can see wild America and you can watch lions and badgers and antelope eating and sleeping and doing what they do. But for some reason, wanting to see people doing the same thing is considered sick and perverse.
Well, I don't know about that exactly.
No,
I mean, to see you naked, people, what's that cost? Like $10 to see you naked? Now, do we see you getting into the shower? Or do we see you getting out of the shower?
It depends.
Do we see you in the shower? You got a camera in the shower?
Not yet.
All right, well, good for you. I think like I said before, I think this is the best idea I've heard for that silly internet thing.
Thank you.
Yeah, nice meeting you.
But I'm not just bringing this up to defend the honor of Twitch streamers. In these early interactions, we can see the beginnings of a very familiar dynamic. Not long before this, the closest thing to internet clout was like being the admin for a Star Wars forum. Now, people were discovering that the internet had a sort of economy where privacy could be exchanged for attention. In the case of Wrigley, though, despite the attention that she was getting, she was pretty resistant to monetizing GennyCam for the majority of the time that it was going. Like, she didn't even run banner ads, saying that she thought of the site as a piece of experimental performance art. To see an example of people who did wind up monetizing, though, let's look at the other main group of people who were making content back then. The bloggers. Blogs had existed since the very beginning of the internet, but due to the requirements of knowing how to code and host your own website, they weren't really something that the general public was involved in. This changed in the early 2000s when blogging platforms like WordPress, Blogspot, and LiveJournal came onto the scene and opened the doors to anyone with an internet connection and strongly held opinions. At their height, blogs occupied a bit of a weird space in culture. Just thinking back to when I was a kid, they were kind of a punchline in the way that like being a white guy with a podcast is today. But I think it went a bit further than that. Especially early on, there were all these opinion pieces being written about how narcissistic society was becoming now that people were publishing opinion pieces of their own without needing to go through the traditional gatekeepers of mainstream media. This was obviously a very real and valid concern about the state of kids these days, and not in any way motivated by the fact that blogs like Talking Points Memo, Page 666, and Pitchfork were increasingly presenting an alternative to traditional mainstream media, and were quickly making large parts of the newspaper, magazine, and cable news industries irrelevant. But the genre of bloggers who may have had the biggest impact on the creator economy as we know it today were actually mommy bloggers. Sites like the appropriately named themommyblog.com, the cleverly named Girls Gone Child, and the nightmarishly millennial childbearing hipster began popping up and allowing young mothers to connect with one another and openly share the realities of being a new mom in ways that were unheard of at the time. As Taylor Lorenz writes in her book Extremely Online, The Untold Story of Fame, Influence, and Power on the Internet, quote, "Mommy bloggers wrote deeply personal, raw, and unfiltered accounts of the sides of motherhood not found in parenting books. They spoke candidly about suffering from postpartum depression, struggling to breastfeed, and drinking wine during playtime. No topic was off limits." The early blogs were all about telling the messy story, explained Catherine Connors, who started the blog Her Bad Mother in 2005, and is now a writer and consultant in Los Angeles. And there was a sense that, yes, it had to be really brutally honest if it was going to get an audience. Readers craved an antidote to the idealized depiction of motherhood that was championed by traditional media. and they found it in blogs. One of these bloggers was Heather Armstrong, who founded deuce.com in 2001 and quickly became one of the largest bloggers in the space. In 2004, facing growing financial troubles, Armstrong made a decision that would ripple out and forever change the nature of content creation online. She monetized her blog. Now, this should not have been a big deal, like at all. Basically, every blog had been running ads for years at this point, but mommy bloggers were different. It was seen as extremely bad taste for them to earn any money for the content that they were making. I think a big part of this obviously comes from the way that child rearing and just women's work in general isn't seen as being deserving of financial compensation, but also Lorenz argues that another reason for the taboo is because the appeal of these blogs was their perceived authenticity. Running ads made them look like tacky sellouts. This, by the way, is genuinely wild to me. Like, I feel like in 2024, if I see a site that has no ads and isn't like run by the government, my first thought is that something has gone horribly, horribly wrong. But I think that this touches on something really interesting. Speaking right now as someone who, like, I know for a fact that there are people who have a parasocial relationship with me. From my end of things, one of the really weird parts of that is how it's not really me that people have this one-sided relationship with, but rather the parts of myself that I show online. Let's just be clear here. You don't know me. We aren't friends. In fact, I'm your op. I want you dead. But like, I'm not trying to go all woe is me, being an internet person is so hard. Like, I've been able to arrange my life in such a way that I never need to wake up before 11 a.m. I'm clearly very lucky. But something that I think that you can see in the case of Armstrong, and also that I, as well as most YouTubers I've met, are very aware of, is that if you're an internet person, you kind of always have to be aware of what people expect from this online character you've created. Because the thing that audiences really hate isn't really bad behavior so much as behavior that's inconsistent with the image you've cultivated. Like, I doubt the Deuce fans who freaked out when Armstrong started running ads acted that way towards every blogger they saw with banner ads. The issue, I think, is that by acknowledging that the blog was a job and one that she deserved to be paid for, Armstrong had broken the facade. The sin they felt she had committed wasn't advertising, but dishonesty. But regardless, despite the hate they received, Armstrong and soon other mommy bloggers like her said fuck the haters and secured the bag. Not just running banner ads, but also taking sponsorship deals from major companies who were desperate to reach the valuable new mother demographic. Over the next couple of years, the mommy bloggers would go on to create a business model that persists to the point where it is very literally how I make a living today. Okay, but pretty soon blogs would become social media campaigns for fast food chains and weapons manufacturers, while the social aspects of them migrated to Twitter. Meanwhile, lifecasters would move on to camming or else walking away from their camera while a video essay plays on their Twitch stream. Enough of this shit about people who ran their own sites on the old internet, and let's get into the companies that came to dominate that space. But first, a little bit of context about what the business climate looked like. Of course, this is a video essay, and so when I say a little bit of context, what I mean is, following World War II, the US emerged as the dominant manufacturer on the world stage, owing to most of its competitors in Europe and Asia having been bombed to shit. But as the Cold War ramped up and America began pumping aid money into rebuilding Japan and West Germany to prevent them from going communist, both countries were able to rapidly develop their manufacturing industries, and by the mid-60s they were beginning to compete with the US auto industry. By the 70s, the new competition, along with the US dollar being devalued in the Plaza Accord, led to a decline in the profitability of American manufacturing. American firms first tried to fix this by emulating Japan's hyper-lean manufacturing model, as well as a good old-fashioned attack on unions, but it was too little too late, and by the 90s, American venture capitalists decided to get the fuck out of manufacturing and see what this whole internet thing was all about by pumping an ungodly amount of money into newly emerging telecom industries. This, by the way, is where we first saw the growth before profit model that we all know and love. Basically, as soon as the internet became a commercial endeavor, people figured that that the only way to succeed there was to grab market share as quickly as possible in order to make a monopoly. And so VCs threw money at anything they could, trying to bet on the winners. This all led to the formation not only of the business model for all of the worst tech companies on Earth today, but also the dot-com bubble. Well, generally, we tend to think of this time as not really having produced much beyond massively overvalued companies and a couple good Simpsons bits.
Now, Bart, we can't pay you salary, but we can give you stock.
How's your company gonna make money? Do you have a business model?
How many shares of stock will it take to end this conversation?
So first of all, did I just steal Unlearning Economics' bit of showing Simpsons clips while talking about economics? Yes, absolutely, this is a harassment campaign. But also, while it was around, the dot-com bubble did actually lead to the creation of a lot of the infrastructure that made the modern internet possible. Thanks both to market necessity as well as some government regulations, during the boom, companies made massive investments in computing infrastructure by developing networks and servers, modernizing their computers, as well as laying the underwater cables that carry the internet across the ocean. Also, isn't that fucking crazy that that's how the internet travels across continents? Like, if you've ever communicated with or like consumed the content of someone on a different continent as you, that's literally because of fiber optic cables that were just dropped on the ocean floor. And like, literally, they did that the same way that they did telegrams in like the 1840s. I'm not trying to tie this into any bigger point here, by the way, but just if you take nothing else from this video, I hope that from now on, whenever someone you know mentions the internet, you just go, you mean the tubes at the bottom of the ocean? Yeah, I've heard of them. You know, I just don't think that that's too much to ask. In the time between this video and my last one, it was literally my birthday, and the only thing I wished for when I blew up my candles was for every single person who watches this video to do that at least once. What were we talking about again? In 2000, the dot-com bubble burst. There was a bunch of factors here, including Japan going into recession, the NASDAQ crashing, the Fed raising interest 6 times in 1 year, not to mention the Y2K panic, as well as Microsoft being found guilty of being a monopoly, all of which unsettled the market and got people to start saying, wait a second, do any of these internet companies actually make any money? To which the answer was very often absolutely not. And so the endless stream of money dried up, causing most internet companies to shut down as VCs moved their money to a much safer investment: housing. Absolutely no way that could ever be a bubble. Foreshadowing is, so now let's start digging into the platforms that would emerge in the wake of the bust and go on to lay the groundwork for the tech giants that now rule the world. But first, we should maybe clarify our terms a bit by explaining exactly what a platform is. In his book, Platform Capitalism, Srnicek argues that at the most basic level, all platforms have 2 characteristics. Firstly, they act as intermediaries between 2 or more people by providing infrastructure that allows connections or exchanges to happen. And second, they all benefit from what's called the network effect. Basically, since the thing that they provide is the opportunity for interactions, the more people there are using the platform, the more valuable it is both for the owners and users. Like, I'm guessing the reason why you're watching this on YouTube right now isn't because you just love the site's UI, but instead because this is where people post to.
Go for it. I like stuff like that.
Yeah?
Nothing bothers me like that.
Awesome. Just don't want to assume, you know? Some people have also argued that platforms needing to capture a massive amount of users in order to get the network effect means that they tend to become natural monopolies. But that's crazy. I mean, come on, it's not like there's just one website, there's 4. I'll be going into much more detail about how networks work later on, but for now, that's really all you need to know. Now, let's get into the first internet platforms that shaped the basis for what we now think of as social media. The first of these was 6degrees.com, which was founded in 1998, and as the name suggests, was based around connecting users with people who they knew or were up to 6 degrees of separation away from. In its first 2 years, 6 Degrees gained 3.5 million users, most of whom were very young. It then shut down in 2000 after being sold to Youthstream Media Networks, an advertising company that focuses on targeting ads at children. So, cool. Then, in '99, there was Makeout Club. The site's horrible name was taken from the title of a song by the '90s indie band Unrest. Makeout Club was aimed at alternative and indie youth culture, or as the site put it, indie rockers, hardcore kids, record collectors, artists, bloggers, and hopeless romantics. Gross. In keeping with presumably letting every decision be made by a pop-punk frontman who hooks up with underage fans, Makeout Club was also very much in line with what MySpace would become, with somewhat customizable profiles and the ability to talk to people who you didn't know IRL. The site thankfully never really took off, largely because it was just too early, showing up when it was still really uncool to meet people online. It did manage to stick around on life support though up until 2017. And then there was Friendster, founded by Jonathan Abrams in 2003, which was the perfect sweet spot when digital cameras had just become mainstream. This was very much the proto-Facebook. Your name was just your first name and the initial of your last name, and similar to 6 Degrees, you were meant to connect to your actual friends and could only see people who you had a maximum of 3 degrees of separation from. Something that's really funny about Abrams, though, is that he loves talking about how he was motivated to make Friendster because he just cares so deeply about authenticity and connection.
All right, so let's get into the good stuff. Where does the idea for Friendster come from?
Well, it's funny. Everybody always wants those Pez dispenser moments.
Right, right.
Those are mostly invented, not really true.
100%. Yeah.
That sort of, we're walking in the park and you had that epiphany right at that moment, and that's where it came from. Most of those stories are actually made up and not really true. The reality of Friendster is that it was the synthesis of all sorts of stuff. I had been interested in using computers to connect people really my whole life. When I was a teen on my Commodore 64, I had a stupid BBS with maybe 5 people on it, and then at both Nortel and Netscape, those were companies that were really using computers to connect people through telephony and through the internet. That was in my entire career, how I had chosen to work on computers, specifically, using computers to connect people rather than, accounting software or video games or other things.
The thing is that it seems like this is at least not completely true. When he was asked about this back in 2003, Abrams gave a pretty different answer, saying that he made the site to help his single friends who found online dating creepy, and that, quote, with JDate, a guy is almost bound to be 20 pounds heavier or 20 pounds older than he is in his photo. We're trying to make the process more accountable. People will put a more accurate picture of themselves on Friendster because your friends will see it. Also, just for some context there, he specifically mentioned JDate because he was talking to a newspaper called Jewish News of Northern California. That wasn't just his go-to dating site that he thought of. Also, Abrams is himself Jewish. Anyway, the claim that Abrams started Friendster as a dating site was backed up by his friend and investor, Mark Pincus, who said to the New York Times in 2006, quote, basically, Jonathan wanted to meet girls. He told me himself. He started Friendster as a way to surf through his friends' address books for good-looking girls. Or in yet another Times piece, this time from an article from 2003 in which they interviewed Dana Boyd, a sociologist who studied and then later came to advise Friendster. In her interview, she said that she found it frustrating to work with Abrams because, quote, he didn't want to know anything that would help user experiences unless it had to do with dating. That article's actually amazing. After she says that, the reporter asked Boyd if she would date Abrams or any of his friends, and she responded, oh God, no. Now, I realize that I'm coming in pretty hot here. Let me just say that I don't really care that much about Jonathan Abrams making a dating site. It's just that despite those quotes I just showed you, as well as literally every article I could find about this from that time claiming that Friendster started as a dating site, Abrams denies this to this day, and he's really defensive about it. In every recent interview I've seen, Abrams goes out of his way to bring this up completely unprovoked, just so that he can say that no, actually, Friendster wasn't meant to be for dating.
And how much, because, I obviously went back and read all the early articles from the time, and those early articles always contextualize it as a dating app. So was that in your thinking at all? How much of that at the very beginning was were people actually using it to, meet chicks and stuff?
Well, so the idea actually was that it was not a dating app. The idea was that it was something that was not online dating, but could be used for online dating, of course, because the reality is anything there is, some people are going to try to exploit it for dating, anything.
Or like in this interview with Mashable, where he's talking about his current project, a news aggregator called Nuzzle, Abrams just changes the subject mid-interview specifically so that he can say that he wasn't trying to get laid on Friendster. Right now, running Nuzzle, I read a lot of online news. I see stuff every day that isn't true. There was the idea that I started Friendster to meet girls, to get dates, which was never true. Dude, at this point, no one cares about why you made it, but going out of your way to deny it over 20 years later is insane. This is especially funny to me too, because Abrams talks a lot about how important Friendster was and how much he completely changed everything in a way that, like, I genuinely do think that Friendster is extremely interesting and important, but the way this guy talks about it is a bit much.
And you personally have made your peace with that social networking has taken over the world. Not your social network though. You understand that and you've made your peace with it.
Well, I mean, it's on one hand, I'm an engineer and I'm an entrepreneur. I don't sit around wallowing in the past. I just build stuff, and since then I've built new stuff, and today I'm working on Nuzzle, and people love Nuzzle, and it's cool, and the idea, and I think this is remains today. Clearly, Facebook proves that I was right. That my vision was for you to be interacting with with your real friends. You're just talking about the convergence of technology with people. I mean, this is the most in some ways the most obvious thing ever. I mean, the fact that I had to invent in 2002 the idea that that sort of you should use the internet to connect with people in a way that's somewhat sort of like real life. I mean, that was an innovation is kind of funny if you think about it. I mean,
but what's ironic about this is that so many of these big platforms that he evidently feels that Friendster should be compared to actually did start as dating sites. As most people know, Facebook started as a gross hot or not site that Mark Zuckerberg used to rank girls in his classes at Harvard. In 2005, the co-founder of PayPal, Max Levchin, also made basically the same thing and called it Babe Ranker before rebranding it as a photo sharing site called Slide. Another one that I had no idea started as a dating site before researching this video is this one. Isn't that nuts? Like, that's why it's called YouTube. This is real. The original slogan was tune in, hook up. Basically, the story goes that YouTube was originally created because Steve Chen, Chad Hurley, and Joed Kareem were trying to find video of Janet Jackson's nipple popping out at the Super Bowl halftime show. Apparently, from there, the conversation eventually turned into these three guys deciding that they should start a dating site. But unlike other sites where you'd have pictures of yourself, what would make YouTube different, aside from having a horrible name, would be that instead of pictures, you'd have to upload videos. If that sounds like an absolute nightmare, you're correct. Apparently, Chen, Hurley, and Kareem were so desperate to get women to join that they put up Craigslist ads offering $100 to any attractive women who'd be dumb enough to upload videos of themselves there. The site didn't work for every reason that you're thinking of until people started to realize that while these guys had created literally the worst dating site I could imagine, in the process, they'd actually managed to make a site that was amazing for hosting and streaming videos. Now, all this stuff is normally brought up to show how weird and creepy the founders of these sites are, and while, yes, correct, it is interesting how much the internet owes to people being horny. For instance, as I pointed out in my video about surveillance capitalism, recommendation algorithms like the ones used by Amazon, Netflix, YouTube, and just every major website now, these all evolved out of matchmaking programs that were developed by early dating sites. Ironically, if Abrams actually owned that he made Friendster to get dates, that would make him way more legit. But the most interesting thing to me about Abrams denying making a dating site is the fact that, intentional or not, he kinda did. From posting a thirst trap in your Instagram story hoping that a specific person will see it, all the way back to logging in and out of MSN Messenger so that your crush would get a notification, we all use social media for dating. And so, while making hot or not sites is obviously fucking gross, in the case of Abrams at least, it doesn't seem like he was trying to do anything particularly creepy. And I think that it's almost kind of poetic that these sites that we all use for dating in some way or another were actually made by people who were themselves trying to do the same exact thing. But speaking of how we act on social media, Friendster, with its use of real names, public posts, bios, and pictures, created a new type of behavior online. As McNeil points out in Working, before this, pretty much all interactions on the internet would either be private or anonymous. We tend to think of those words as synonyms, but they're actually really important differences. Privacy refers to how available something is, while anonymity is more about how much information is shared. An email is private, while a forum post is anonymous. Friendster created a new category, not public, private, or anonymous, but performative. People began crafting a very intentional self-portrait of themselves and how they'd like to be seen, deeply aware that they're performing for an audience of people who are themselves performing as well. But what about when the performers get a bit too silly with it? Part of what caused the fall of Friendster was fakesters, what we'd probably call gimmick accounts today. These were people who'd create accounts pretending to be celebrities, characters from movies, TV, or books with names like Quentin T, Homer S, or Toru O. Oh, what, you weren't reading the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle in 1995? Guess I was just a pretty cool 2-year-old. You'd think that these accounts would be no big deal, even a good thing, since they showed that there was a thriving community of people who were excited to get creative with the medium. But no, Abrams fucking hated this and came after the fakesters so hard that you'd think they'd accuse him of starting Friendster as a dating site. Remember, the way Friendster worked was that it was supposed to be a way to connect people who knew each other in real life, and so users couldn't interact with anyone who they were more than 3 degrees of separation away from. But now, fakesters pretending to be Lemony Snicket and Winn-Dixie were breaking this. Yeah, I figured I'd throw in some literary references that you Philistines would be a bit more familiar with. But while a lot of these accounts were just shitposts, for some of them, breaking the site was kind of the point. The 3 degrees of separation policy had some genuine drawbacks that fakester accounts were a hack to get around. For example, one woman told the SF Weekly in 2003 that she started an account for a local gay bar to help queer people in San Francisco meet each other. This really pissed off Abrams, who responded by writing to the same newspaper saying that, quote, "The whole point of Friendster is that you're connected to somebody through mutual friends, not by virtue of the fact that you both like Reese's peanut butter cups." Yeah, no idea why this guy was having trouble getting dates. Now, to be honest, I can see both sides of this debate. On the one hand, the fakesters had genuinely identified a handful of needs that the site wasn't meeting. Not just with the gay bar example either. Adding data as a friend was a more fun and genuine feeling way to express your love of Star Trek than just saying that you liked it in your bio. On the other hand, though, fakesters did break the 3 degrees of separation rule, a feature that, as we've established, was a core part of Abrams' dating site, since, quote, people will put more accurate pictures of themselves on Friendster because they know their friends will see it. And to be clear, these fakester accounts weren't just shit posters. There were absolutely catfish and scammers using fake accounts too. You would think that there must have been some reasonable compromise to be made that addressed the fakesters' issues while still allowing the site to police actual bad actors. Instead, they went to war. Friendster began devoting basically all of their moderation efforts to cracking down on fakester accounts, ignoring most other issues, like, for example, the growing presence of neo-Nazis on the site who were harassing other users, but doing so under their real names, which meant that it was fine. In response, a group of enraged fakesters who called themselves the Borg Collective tried to fight back by flooding the site with thousands of fake accounts, all pretending to be Jonathan Abrams. These people claimed that they were going to start a fakester revolution and also referred to Friendster purging their accounts as the fakester genocide, which I'm not trying to besmirch their noble cause, but genocide is a bit much. One member of the Borg Collective, known only as Roy Batty, went so far as to write a manifesto affirming his right to roleplay as a character from Blade Runner, saying, quote, "Identity is provisional. Who we are is whom we choose to be at any given moment, depending on personality, whim, temperament, or subjective need. No other person or organization can abridge that right, as shape-shifting is inherent to human consciousness and allows us to thrive and survive under greatly differing circumstances by becoming different people as need or desire arises. By assuming the mantle of the other, it allows us, paradoxically, to become ourselves. Every day is Halloween." Honestly, he's kind of cooking. The Fakester Wars were heavily reported on, and most of the coverage claimed that this is what killed Friendster. However, wouldn't you guess, the only thing Jonathan Abrams is weirder about than Friendster having been started as a dating site is the claim that going after the Fakesters was what doomed the site. Another
issue that I remember from the time is sort of the battle that Friendster had against these fakesters. These you very much wanted this to be what we know of today, like this online identity, right?
Yeah, the vision of Friendster was that people would use their real name and real identity, and I think that was completely right. And you look at Facebook today, and it's real names and real identity, and the idea that people really wanted fake profiles was really silly and obviously not true. But again, back to the press, there was just a lot of distortions. Friendster didn't have a business model, or Friendster's just for dating or not for dating or whatever. And another one of them was about this Fakester war thing. So that was something that was just wildly exaggerated. There was this sort of meme that occurred that we were mean jerks, especially me, who didn't like, creative expression or whatever, which is hilarious because somebody like that would have never created something like Friendster in the first place. It was definitely the fact that our site was barely working. That was a huge problem, and this went on for a long time, and it was way more prevalent than the fail whale at Twitter. This went on for like 2 years.
Now, I think that there is definitely some truth to what he's saying here. Like, at the time, Friendster was a major company and had 3 million active users. Obviously, this one issue wasn't the only reason it went under. However, I also think that Abrams is a liar, and the way he talks about this is very delusional.
When you're working on a startup that is still extremely small and extremely young and new, and already it's like you're Microsoft or AT&T or something, and everybody's coming after you, to be still, struggling to keep our site up, still be having no idea of how big it was going to go, being so busy working, growing it. And yet at the same time, every day we're seeing another copycat saying they're going to kill us. And I actually had a news company, a music company, and Yelp all very eager to basically, have those things as applications on top of the social graph at Friendster. This is years and years and years before Facebook launched their platform. But I couldn't get those things done because the other CEOs were pushing their own different agendas. I wanted to do a music thing. I had a music startup in San Francisco that...
Now, something that sounds like total bullshit, but is actually completely correct about what he said there, is that there were tons of Friendster copycats. And while going after the Fakesters may not have been what ended the site, it was the inspiration for the thing that would. In 2003, Chris DeWolf and Tom Anderson were in the business of scamming people. Both men had been laid off from a site called Xdrive in 2001 as the dot-com bubble was bursting, and decided to start a company of their own called ResponseBase, which was a marketing company in the loosest and sketchiest sense of the word. For example, after 9/11, they made a site where people could download free American flag cursors that came with adware that caused pop-ups advertising ResponseBase's clients. Basically, if, like me, you ever destroyed your family's PC by installing every custom skin you could find for Windows Media Player, you may well have these guys to thank for that. Despite multiple fairly high-profile exposés on their scams, Anderson and DeWolf were doing pretty well for themselves. And so, in September 2002, just over a year after starting the company, they sold it for $3 million and became a subdivision of eUniverse, a marketing company sometimes referred to as the trailer park of the internet, since they were buying up every sketchy tech startup that they could get their hands on. After the buyout, DeWolf took over most of the work running ResponseBase, while Anderson basically just fucked off to China, ostensibly to handle manufacturing for the products they'd sell through pop-ups and junk mail. But also, given the fact that his first job out of college before coming to xDrive was running a porn site called teamasian.com, I feel like he may have had some ulterior motives there. But while in China, Tom took notice of the Fakester rebellion of 2003 being brutally stamped out and thought that Friendster was making a huge mistake by not giving their users what they wanted. Seeing an opportunity, he flew back to America and burst into DeWolf's office to tell him that they should innovate on the space by creating a low-budget ripoff of Friendster. At the time, ResponseBase was doing badly due to bad accounting as well as legislation and the adaptation of spam filters making their bulk email advertising business increasingly unviable. They decided to go all in on cloning Friendster, and so MySpace was born. Everything about the creation of MySpace was in some way sketchy and half-assed. They didn't even come up with the name. MySpace.com was just a domain they had bought off a cloud storage company that gone belly up in 2001. When it came to recruiting members, first they forced all eUniverse employees to make accounts and then started sending out junk mail inviting people to join, as well as spamming Friendster with links. MySpace was also much looser with their moderation. Not only were they more than happy to welcome the fakesters, they were also able to poach one of Friendster's biggest accounts. Despite having over 40,000 friends, Nguyen T. Tien Tan, better known by her screen name Tila Tequila, was constantly being banned off of Friendster for posting lewds. After the 5th time this happened, she decided that she was fed up with the site and migrated over to MySpace, bringing her audience with her. But this half-assedness, combined with Anderson's firmly held belief in giving the users whatever they wanted, turned out to be what made MySpace a success. One extremely iconic example of this was the way MySpace let users edit code on their pages. That was originally a glitch. Basically, MySpace was built using a coding language called Cold Fusion. Now, I know literally nothing about back-end web development, so I'm not really sure if this is still how things work, a quirk of Cold Fusion, or how things used to work, or maybe all of the above, but when you're making a site that allowed users to contribute by, for example, adding text or pictures, you had to manually block them from also inserting their own code. MySpace, being a massive rush job, had forgotten to do that and thought that they had been hacked when they first saw an edited page. If this had happened on Friendster, Jonathan Abrams would have fixed it immediately and then spent the next several decades claiming it never happened. But instead, Tom Anderson just said, fuck it, if this is something that the users want, then it stays in. This became one of MySpace's most defining features and was especially popular with a group who aren't usually thought of as early tech adopters, but really should be, teenage girls. Literally, I can't count how many women I know who at least know the basics of HTML and CSS thanks to MySpace and Neopets. Another instance of MySpace saying fuck it that would come to be a defining moment for the internet happened in late 2003. By then, MySpace had grown to the point where it and Friendster were in open competition, but also both sites were now struggling to deal with the growing server demands of running massive social media sites. One of the most well-known issues with Friendster was that it always took forever for pages to load. The reason for this was that fucking 3 degrees of separation thing again. On top of requiring a complete purging of the site's shit posters to stay functional, it also caused pages to take forever to load. The reason for this was because before you could open a page, Friendster had to first calculate the connections of every user on the site to determine whether or not you were allowed to see that page. This may not have been a huge deal when the site was just a small network of women Jonathan Abram wanted to fuck, but as Friendster grew, this required exponentially more processing power. To deal with this, Friendster invested $13 million, about $22.2 million today, into top-of-the-line Apache Tomcat servers and the best engineers in the field. By contrast, MySpace could only afford to spend $33K, about $56,000 today, to get 2 Dell servers. Since they weren't able to outspend Friendster, MySpace went looking for a different way to speed their site up. As a cheap knockoff of Friendster, MySpace had the same problem, but rather than buying military-grade servers, MySpace just said fuck it and let everyone see each other's pages, as Tom Anderson wrote on his blog. To keep the site running fast, I decided to just get rid of the networking code and let everyone view everyone else. It took all of about 5 minutes for me to realize that users preferred this greatly. You guys are very vocal. Within minutes, I got tons of comments and emails supporting the change. It turned out that very few people were interested in degrees of friendship. I love this so much. The contrast between Jonathan Abrams being so desperate to keep this stupid feature that he was willing to spend a fortune, tank the site's performance, and start an all-out war against his own users versus Tom fucking Anderson, who just deleted a line of code, then took the rest of the afternoon off, is the clearest representation of the Soy Jack versus Chad meme that I've ever seen. So first of all, from here, MySpace really took off and pretty firmly left Friendster in the dust, doomed to be lost to the sands of time, never to be thought of again until this video for some reason. Over the next couple of years, MySpace became the largest social media site on Earth, and in 2005 it was sold for $580 million to Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation. A year later, they signed a deal with Google to sell the search giant 50% of their ad space for 3 years in exchange for a cool $900 million. But getting rid of degrees of separation didn't just cause MySpace to surpass Friendster. It also played a key role in creating modern influencers. Like I mentioned with Jenny Cam, the mommy bloggers, as well as big Friendster accounts like Tila Tequila, developing an internet following wasn't exactly a new thing, but the fame those previous generations of creators received was far from the norm, more of a glitch than anything, but not on MySpace. Just like with custom profiles, the glitch had become a feature. The ability to view and friend any profile on the world's largest social media site made a brand new type of fame possible. Weird kids in their rooms could now join or even create whole subcultures, like in the case of the first Scene Kids. Some savvy users were able to take advantage of the site and its mainly teenage user base to launch themselves to full-on celebrity status. One example of this was, I shit you not, Dane Cook. It's actually kind of sweet. Despite reaching a level of celebrity that's extremely rare, even for good stand-up comics, Cook never forgot who got him there and has stayed extremely in touch with teenagers even now in his 50s. In fairness, that might have just been an elaborate way for him to get back into Joe Rogan's good books despite being a joke thief. Anyway, from around late 2007 to early 2008, MySpace hit its peak as the dominant social media site with over 300 million active users. But over the next year or so, it would soon be all over, never to be so back again. There were a few factors that contributed to this. For one thing, thanks to that deal with Google, the site was covered in ads. Not only did this just suck because ads are annoying, but they also slowed down the site, messed with parts of its functionality, and prevented them from experimenting with new features as easily as their competitors. Also, the DIY anything goes attitude that contributed to MySpace's original appeal also came with a downside, which was that there was a lot of sketchy shit on there and a virtually non-existent moderation team. Combine that with a user base made up mostly of teenagers, and you get everything from cyberbullying and harassment to sex criminals luring kids to other countries. And so it's not surprising that by 2009, MySpace was dethroned by a new site that was much more heavily moderated, had a clean corporate look, and ties to Ivy League institutions. But before we get into the story of the Facebook and other sites that now dominate the internet, we need to go back to a particular day in 2007. Well, they kicked me out of the mall. Part 2, the internet as a person. On January 9th, Steve Jobs walked onto a stage at Macworld in San Francisco to deliver a keynote where he unveiled the iPhone. Watching it today, it's surreal seeing the crowd clap in amazement as they're first introduced to features like scrolling or an address book.
All right, you want to see that again? Go to sleep. We wanted something that you couldn't do by accident in your pocket and just slide it across, boom. Well, how do I scroll through my list of artists? How do I do this? I just take my finger, and I scroll. That's it. And I've got this little keyboard, which is phenomenal. So I can just say, sounds great. See you there. And I can send that. And there it is. Right? It's that simple.
To say that these are mundane now is an understatement. Scrolling on my phone, selecting a contact, typing on a screen, these actions are etched so deeply into my brain that they don't even register on a conscious level. Looking back now, jobs might as well have been demonstrating walking or opening doors. And I don't want to sound like an Apple fanboy here. I was also ridiculously late to the party here, since I didn't get an iPhone until around 2014, not because I'm like an Android guy, but because all throughout high school and university, my parents insisted on me getting prepaid phones from 7-Eleven. Like, I don't even think that that was like cheaper to do it that way. They just wanted me to seem as much like a drug dealer as possible, apparently. But the effects of this change were so dramatic that they were even felt on my Alcatel One Touch. Looking back, I don't know if I've ever lived through any technological shifts that had this much of an impact on daily life. Every new generation of computer or device feels like an incremental shift to something a little faster, smoother, or brighter. But the first iPhone wasn't just a step forward, it was a whole new way of moving through the world. In Lurking, McNeil describes the experience of getting her first iPhone in a way that feels almost like a love letter. The tactile quality conjured up feelings of intimacy and trust. I held the iPhone so gently at first, like applying eyeshadow with my fingertips, the lightest touch. What else do people handle with such care? Bodies. I started to go to bed with it. It became a paperweight to rest on a pillow. Then it seamlessly integrated with my daily life, so that now I scarcely think of it, the same way I don't think of my fork but what's on my plate. The world, as in elsewhere and far away, became more immediate through the iPhone, but the world surrounding me, my periphery meanwhile, was less present, less urgent than what in the moment I wondered about. I found myself bumping into strangers more frequently. I grew less likely to notice landmarks on a walk in a new city. I never got bored waiting for a train. I no longer dreaded sitting alone with a drink when a friend was running late. I always had something to do. My focus on the screen could keep bar vultures at bay. I was never alone, even when I wasn't using the phone to talk. Never alone. There was always this one little window in between my thumbs. This put an end to the internet as a place, and I don't mean that in a particularly metaphorical way either. Before the iPhone, the internet could very literally be thought of as a place, in that you would access it from a specific room in your home. But after 2007, the internet was everywhere, in everyone's pockets, just a couple swipes away. It was all over. One effect of this is that typing with our thumbs on a touchscreen changed the way we talk online. While just about every boomer has at some point claimed that this is resulting in a decline in the written word, generally accompanied by complaints about how no one writes in cursive anymore, anthropologists have actually argued instead that most online communication shouldn't be thought of as written at all, but instead as an extension of chit-chat. But also, and this is way more anecdotal, but I think that the internet moving from our desks to our pockets changed the tone we write in too. If you wanted to post something before smartphones, you had to go home, sit at your desk, boot up your computer, and open a web page, which took several minutes to do if you were using Friendster. All those steps meant that you had a lot more time to calm down and decide that, you know what, maybe that barista mispronouncing your name didn't warrant a death threat after all. But the ease of use wasn't the only way the iPhone made stochastic terrorism against service employees so common. They also finished what AOL had started back in 1993. They made the internet normal. It's worth remembering that while the iPhone did have a massive impact and genuinely presented a lot of brand new technology, particularly with how much they improved touchscreens,
it's far more accurate than any touch display that's ever been shipped. It ignores unintended touches. It's super smart. You can do multi-finger gestures on it. And boy, have we patented it.
But the majority of the tech in the iPhone was around well before 2007. Apple's big innovation, though, was their ability to bring them all together into one device. I'm not saying any of this to diminish their accomplishment, but just to point out that hardcore tech enthusiasts had been able to do pretty much everything an iPhone could do for years, albeit a lot less seamlessly. The iPhone changed all that, though, taking what was once niche and making it trendy. Before the iPhone, the popular image of an extremely online person was a nerdy guy in his mom's basement. After 2007, it became a vapid hot girl taking selfies. And I know what you're asking now. Source? Source? Where do they post these selfies? What's her at? How can I find them? Where are the selfies? Can I make her love me? To answer that question, let's go through the main platforms that contributed to building the new web and killing the old one. Each of these played a key role in creating the internet as we know it today. That is, the internet where rather than communities talking to each other, we sit in an audience to be fed content. The internet is a person. The internet that's everywhere. We'll start by covering some of MySpace's smaller rivals who each picked off parts of its audience and contributed to the shift in their own unique ways. First up is Tumblr. Now, I'm going to be honest here and say off the top that of the sites that I'm talking about in this section, this is the only one that I've never really interacted with. It's funny how saying I never really used Tumblr all that much just feels like a longer way of saying no homo. But Tumblr changed things a lot, and I'm not just talking about furry art, Steven Universe discourse, or Sherlock fanfic. No, instead, we're talking about the sexy, sexy world of content aggregation. As Lorenz lays out in Extremely Online, it's telling that one of the most popular kind of pages on Tumblr were fuck yeah pages. I'm talking about things like fuck yeah sharks that would basically just repost anything that had to do with sharks. These were fucking everywhere on Tumblr, and it's not hard to see why. The basic strategy was extremely easy, and they would do huge numbers. At their peak, there were almost 200 new fuck yeah pages being started every single day. But what's actually interesting about this is the fact that sharks have special pores around their eyes, nose, and mouth that allow them to sense electromagnetic fields. And what's only a bit less interesting is the way that these kinds of pages showed how content aggregation was a viable business model. While this obviously isn't that big of a deal on the small scale with fuck yeah accounts and similar pages across Tumblr and other platforms, some people were thinking much bigger. One of them was Jonah Peretti, the founder of BuzzFeed, who realized that aggregating content that was going viral on Tumblr and Reddit, sites whose user base was relatively small and insular, and then repackaging them as articles for the wider web could be the basis for a fledgling media empire. And by the way, if, for example, you follow any Instagram pages that just post a bunch of screenshots from Twitter, this is where that model came from. Enjoy Big Dog socialism posts? Make sure you thank BuzzFeed, and if you have time, you could also thank the funny Twitter accounts who write all their content for free. With that said, while a number of media companies made a fortune off of this, if you were the owner of a reasonably successful fuck yeah page, the best you could hope for was like a job running the social media for a big company and maybe, if you were really lucky, a book deal. To see how internet stardom became a real thing, we have to look at another MySpace competitor. This was one of MySpace's smaller rivals, which makes sense since today the majority of its power users are the most online people imaginable, all desperately competing to see who can seem the most normal. It was also the site that absorbed a lot of the old bloggers and shitposters from Friendster before the richest man on earth bought it in order to answer the question, what would happen if you combine the politics of 4chan with the memes of iFunny? That's right, folks, we're talking about Twitter, also known as X, but only if you're divorced and estranged from your children. Founded in 2006 by Jack Dorsey, Ev Williams, Biz Stone, and Noah Glass, Twitter was originally envisioned to be a throwback to early blogging sites and instant messenger, but like, if you took away the fun parts of both of those. Apparently, Dorsey's favorite thing about LiveJournal and AIM was the away status people could write to explain why they weren't online, and so he decided to make a site that was just that. Despite the base concept of the site being honestly pretty sad, Twitter took off as people began to realize its potential as a way of sharing breaking news. Soon, newspapers began tweeting headlines of stories linking back to their sites, local police and fire departments posted announcements, and most important for us, celebrities began joining the site. This was so significant because up until this time, the old guard had seen the internet as weird and unimportant, but Twitter had the clout and momentum to attract famous people. There was also the appeal of the original 140 character limit, which made posting pretty effortless and was thought to be too small for people to get into trouble for posting anything controversial. Yep, that was a real thing that people thought in the aughts. What this meant, though, was that Twitter became the social media site for important people. Just speaking personally as an internet person, while YouTubers aren't important, I can attest that Twitter was the place where I've made the vast majority of my professional connections, since it's just where people in my field hang out. But what this really did, and I think that the truly important legacy of Twitter, is that despite the hierarchy inherent to a platform with publicly displayed follower counts and blue checks, at the end of the day, Barack Obama, Drill, Ashton Kutcher, and John F2359 were now all thrown together on the same platform. Already, the internet made up of random weirdos was disappearing as more and more of the web came to be dominated by inaccessible public figures and corporations with huge audiences. Simultaneously, as the average person was having less and less of a say over the development of the web and its discourse, it was becoming increasingly hard to say that the internet wasn't real life. But for things to really change, a few more pieces needed to fall into place. The next domino was Instagram. Started in 2010 by Kevin Systrom and Mike Krieger, IG was the first social media app to really take advantage of the shift to mobile that the iPhone had caused. Realizing that one of the key selling points of the iPhone was its camera, they decided to create an app that focused on giving people a place to post and edit their pictures. Its big selling point was originally its filters that gave pictures a hipstery, vintage camera feel, with digitally rendered grain or wonky colors as if they'd been shot using expired film or through a Holga with a light leak. Even the names of the filters, like Juno, Lark, Valencia, and Clarendon, sound like the names of obscure lomography cameras. At a time when all media was beginning to be dematerialized into digital files trapped behind the glass of a touchscreen like insects in a display case, it's strangely fitting that one of the apps most responsible for this change would become popular by offering a way to create the artificial impression of physical wear and tear. But Instagram changed things in a much more concrete way too. So far, what I've shown amounts to the groundwork for what would become influencers, but Instagram was where the economics of the influencer industrial complex really came into sharp focus. Ironically, this happened because of two pretty principled stances that Systrom took when he founded Instagram. First of all, he refused to allow advertising on the app. Part of this was in keeping with the Silicon Valley model of growth before profit that started in the dot-com boom, but there was also the much simpler reason that Systrom had started Instagram because he had a genuine passion for photography and didn't want to ruin the aesthetics with a bunch of ads. Secondly, there was the issue of celebrities. While there were plenty on Twitter, Instagram was a bit of a harder sell. Using Instagram didn't just mean posting cat memes or your thoughts about water bottles on planes. This was for sharing pictures, and pictures of celebrities weren't cheap. A lot of famous people expected a payout to use the app. One in particular was the largest account on Instagram in 2011, Justin Bieber, who left the app unless they paid him to post. Systrom, not wanting to set a precedent of paying for content, refused, and eventually Bieber folded and returned to the app. Okay, fine, cool. Dare I even say a little bit based? But this all led to a problem. If you have a bunch of advertisers wanting onto the app and all of these users wanting to get paid, would you look at that? Snoop Dogg just signed up for an account and the first picture he posted is him drinking knockoff Four Loko. Oops, you've just invented Instagram influencers. All of this would be further intensified by Vine and later TikTok. Before these came along, influencers on Instagram were celebrities from other fields who were using new platforms to add another revenue stream. Vine changed all of this. As the app soared to short-lived success, it brought with it a new breed of celebrities who were natives to the vertical screen. And finally, let's talk about the MySpace killer itself, Facebook. Started in 2003 and originally only for Harvard students, the Facebook opened its doors to everyone over the age of 13 in 2006. 2 years later, it took over the web and soon replaced the Y2K McBling aesthetic of MySpace with cool, clean, standardized corporate Memphis. While it wasn't until the Snowden leaks in 2013 that people really started to get wary about privacy, even from the start, there was always something a little bit creepy about Facebook. How exactly could it have so many features and so few ads? Who was actually paying for all of this? I think that the clearest expression of this creepiness happened whenever Facebook rolled out an update to the UI and was met with people starting pages or posting copy-pasta petitions demanding it be changed back. While some of this was obviously just people being resistant to any change, I think that a part of it had to do with how little control users had over the site. Especially compared to MySpace, every update felt like someone had gone into your room and moved stuff around. But the real contribution that Facebook made to the internet as a person came in 2011 when the newsfeed began suggesting content selected by the algorithm rather than being chronological. No longer was the social network showing the life updates of the friends and pages its users had personally curated, but instead a constant drip feed of whatever the site could use to keep you hooked in longer. But while this may have been the point when the frog was finally boiled, Facebook had been pretty secretive about what was going on inside the algorithm's black box for a while, and one of the first big efforts to crack it open and look inside happened a year earlier. Oh, hi. Hello. Hi, Spider. So in 2010, Facebook released an update that changed the layout of profiles. One particular aspect of this change caught the interest of a UK tech blog aimed at teen girls called Shiny. They made a blog post where they pointed out that previously the 6 friends displayed on a person's profile had been completely random, but now when you refresh your profile, those friends would rotate through the same 15 or so people. Shiny reported this news with the headline, "Has Facebook finally introduced who's looking at your profile?" speculating that while a number of the people shown as top friends were people that the author interacted with regularly, a lot of them seemed random. The only explanation, they thought, was that these were people who were lurking her profile. Isn't that right? While I realize this sounds pretty boring, what happened next absolutely isn't. The post blew up with hundreds of comments, mostly from what seemed like teen girls motivated by the prospect of finding out if their crush had worked their profile. This comment thread grew, and soon these teens were performing full-on forensic investigations into the algorithm in ways that very few outside of Facebook HQ had ever done before. They began making dummy Facebook accounts so they could test their theories under scientific conditions. Before long, the 6 friends shown on profile were decided to be a dead end. Instead, they decided that you could get more information by looking at the 5 friends shown on the tag that appears when you moused over a user's name. This came to be nicknamed MO5. That summer, a script was written called Stalker List that could scrape Facebook's JSON file to show each user's affinity score, which the commenters began working to decode. Older generations pulled petals off of daisies to find out if someone liked them back. For these girls, their equivalent was decoding Facebook's EdgeRank algorithm. The Shiny post began spilling out into dedicated forums where, in order to find out if Max G from math class liked them back, these girls were posting comments like this. If you see a name you don't recognize on search bar, for instance, said person will show up on Stalker List as 9.08. If you have viewed them in the past/mutual views, you will see a jump from, say, 14.33 to 23.22, as Kava pointed out earlier. 9.08 is a reflection of your viewing the other site. That number will decrease at a rate of approximately 1.74 per day until, I don't know, I haven't tracked that yet. That seems to be the case when there's no mutual looks. And while it's easy to write this off as just a funny anecdote about the power of women in STEM, the way these girls were examining the algorithm points to a deeper issue of control. When we talk about what users are shown on social media, it tends to be in the context of echo chambers, but there's another, more fundamental aspect of this. Why don't we get any control over what we see? While other social networks were harder to use and came with just so many downsides, something that they allowed for was users getting to decide what their experience would look like. Facebook effectively flipped this. Instead of users controlling the content now controls users. And while I realize that sounds like an overly dramatic anti-vaxxer mic drop line, in the case of Facebook, I genuinely don't think that that's an exaggeration. In 2014, a team of academic researchers published a research paper titled Experimental Evidence of Mass-Scale Emotional Contagion Through Social Networks. The paper describes a massive psychological experiment that they carried out in 2012 on 600,000 randomly selected Facebook users who unknowingly had their news feeds tweaked to either show them more positive or negative posts so that the researchers could see if emotions were contagious. And all of this fits very neatly with Zuckerberg's personally professed beliefs. Almost exactly 1 year after the study was published, Zuck had a town hall Q&A where users could comment questions for him to answer. One of these questions was written by Stephen Hawking, seen here at a barbecue on an island owned by Jeffrey Epstein, a guy who was probably very happy that Facebook didn't publicly display who had recently viewed its 13-year-old users' pages. Hawking asked, "I would like to know a unified theory of gravity and the other forces. Which of the big questions in science would you like to know the answer to, and why?" First of all, I just want to point out that Facebook is so shit that there's actually no way to read Zuckerberg's response without hitting read more 4 times while scrolling through a bunch of nerds all commenting, "Simply epic," or "This wins the internet today." But once you actually make it to Zuckerberg, his response is, "That's a pretty good one. I'm most interested in questions about people. What will enable us to live forever? How do we cure all diseases? How does the brain work? How does learning work? And how can we empower humans to learn 1,000,000 times more? I'm also curious about whether there is a fundamental mathematical law underlying human social relationships that governs the balance of who and what we all care about. I bet there is." So, wow, simply epic. Silicon Valley billionaires for the win. No, but I think that last paragraph perfectly sums up the project of Facebook. Except that fundamental mathematical law isn't something that they're trying to discover, but impose. It's appropriately ironic that an official corporate policy of Facebook is to refer to all users and employees as community members. Aside from this being exactly what an alien pretending to be human would do to fake having friends, this perfectly encapsulates what Facebook is. Not community, but mandatory community. Community as prescribed by an algorithm. The friends you make online and who you interact with aren't organically chosen by you, but for you, in the interest of making sure you stay logged in longer. And this is how the internet died. Not by ceasing to exist or even by being taken over by bots, but instead by these changes that turned all community into content to be fed to us. All interactions become engagement. I wonder a lot about how the rise of AI would have affected us if things had been arranged differently online. A pretty obligatory part of existing today involves all of us having a virtual version of ourselves on social media that we obsessively prune and tend to. Is part of what makes AI so creepy and threatening the possibility of a neural network being able to do that fundamental piece of selfhood as well as or better than we could? We'll get into that more soon, but for now, let's tackle the elephant in the room. This is the big one. The biggest winner to come out of the dot-com boom, the 4th and somehow also 5th most profitable company in the world. In a sense, my personal employer, and the company that, to me, is the most infuriating when it comes to the decline of the internet. Google. Folks, I feel like we can be honest with each other at this point, so let's just be frank. Search fucking sucks now. This isn't just obvious to, everyone online today. It was obvious to Google's founders, Sergey Brin and Larry Page, in 1998 when they first announced the prototype for their new search engine, where they argued that any search engine that's paid for by ads and allows for sponsored posts will inevitably bias the results in unpredictable ways that'll make a worse product for their users. And surprise, surprise, that's exactly what happened. In an article by the Washington Post, they compared Google searches from 2012 2020 to results in the Wayback Machine from 2000. One of the most glaring things to me is how clearly labeled sponsored results used to be, although I guess it makes sense that they wouldn't want those to be as obvious, considering that you now need to scroll 6 times longer to find actual results. But that's just scratching the surface of how fucked all this really is. Let's talk about the air purifiers. I swear this isn't an ad, please stay with me here, but if you're looking to buy an air purifier, one of the best places you can go online is a site called HouseFresh. Their whole deal is just that they publish extremely thorough reviews and buying guides for air purifiers and dehumidifiers. And that's it. No fans, not even humidifiers. All their reviews are, as far as I've been able to tell, extremely well done, backed up by tests that they carry out themselves in-house. More like house fresh. Sorry. From top to bottom, everything about this site is genuinely insane. Like, it can't be making that much money, especially given that they've evidently hired a full team of writers to lovingly review and test all of these products that, if you get a good one, you shouldn't make that a regular purchase. The only way this makes any sense at all is if this is, at least to some extent, a passion project, which only makes it so much weirder. Only a truly sick mind could have created a site like this, and I'm so glad that the internet allows this kind of thing to exist. Or rather, it used to. Despite clearly being authorities on the topic, HouseFresh doesn't show up on any search engines when you look up best air purifiers. But clearly Google fucked with the wrong people here, because in a blog post released back in May, the freaks over at HouseFresh turned all of their maniacal energy towards the search giant and showed in excruciating detail how Google, and from my own tests, most other search engines as well, have been gradually killing small sites like this by burying them under articles by legacy papers and magazines like the New York Times, Wired, Forbes, Rolling Stone, Better Home and Garden, and of course, lots and lots of shopping pages directly from Google. To me, the craziest part of this post is how they seem to show that Google actively collaborates with these big companies. In July of 2022, Google made an update to their search rankings to prioritize reviews that mention testing the products, and coincidentally, the day before this was announced, a ton of companies changed all of their reviews to include mentions of testing and labs that they apparently do and have. I highly recommend reading the article yourself, since I can't get into everything here, but it's absolutely wild. They go through a bunch of these listicles and show how, rather than actually testing anything, they just buy these photos of air purifiers being put in plastic enclosures, which, by the way, were all taken by just one guy. They also talk about how these magazines were bought by private equity companies and then started putting out listicles with Amazon affiliate links, all of which recommend all of the shittiest, most overpriced products possible, since they make a commission whenever you buy using their links. I could go on. It's genuinely one of the best pieces of journalism I've seen in a long time. Link in the description. Anyway, I'm just glad that this only applies to air purifiers. I mean, can you imagine how fucked we'd be if the same thing was happening with microwaves or vacuums? But the thing is, with Google, this feels oddly personal in a way that's different from any other site. Like, we aren't talking about some social media platform I scroll when I'm bored. I use Google every day, not just for work either, but whenever I wonder about a random fact, Google it. Just like how the iPhone embedded scrolling into all of our motor cortices, Google feels like more than just a verb, but instead a part of how we think. In fact, as McNeil points out, the use of the term search is itself kind of a misnomer. Searching implies an active action of looking for something, hunting it down. Searching is what happens when Google fails. Instead, like everything online now, Google feeds me answers to every passing question as effortlessly as possible. And I fucking love it. Now, before we go into exactly what's gone wrong, I want to add a bit more context for how platforms like Google actually work, which, again, video essayist here, so when I say that, what I mean is, in platform capitalism, Nick Srnicek breaks platforms down into 4 categories, each with their own unique business model. First up are what are called product platforms. Some examples of this are Spotify and, interestingly, Rolls-Royce. So to explain that one, a big part of Rolls-Royce's business is actually making jet engines, and the thing you gotta understand about the jet engine business is that it's extremely expensive to make them, and there's a lot of competition, so margins are paper thin. All the money is instead in repairing the engines, but like, anyone can do that. The way Rolls-Royce decided to solve this is by essentially giving their engines away for free, but installing sensors in them and then charging airlines per mile flown with all maintenance costs factored in. You may recognize this as the products as services model. The list of companies doing this is constantly growing in new and increasingly grotesque ways. Next are industrial platforms like GE and Siemens. These are manufacturers that have created manufacturing lines where each part of the product and the machines making it talk to each other. This has lots of benefits in terms of efficiency and customizability, but also allows them to lock down their products, preventing them from being compatible with those of their competitors or being repaired by a third party. Then there's what Srnicek calls lean platforms like Uber and Airbnb. The reason he calls them lean is because unlike other types of platforms, these ones don't own or really even produce anything. Like, obviously we all know that they don't own their own cars or hotels or whatever, but it actually goes so much further than that. In the case of Uber, their maps all come from Google, their messaging feature comes from a company called Twitio, emails are handled by SendGrid, payments are processed by Braintree, and they rent their servers from Amazon. They literally don't do anything. Something I also love about the book is how everything is discussed in a very neutral way, where he just very clearly breaks down the ways that these businesses operate. Like it or hate it, this is just the way that Rolls-Royce makes money. And then you get to lean platforms and he's just like, these motherfuckers are fucking trash, fuck Uber, yeah, I said it. And like, he is right. As much as we can rightly criticize the other companies I've mentioned, they do all innovate in some way that could, at least in theory, be good. Like, Spotify is a horrible, horrible company, but I mean, paying a subscription to have all the music you want isn't a bad idea in and of itself. Uber and Airbnb aren't like that though. Not only is their only innovation finding loopholes that get around regulations and worker treatment practices, not only is their only contribution owning the platform so they can extract a monopoly rent on all transactions, but also gig work only exists by exploiting economic downturns. As Srnicek points out, the majority of people doing Uber are way overeducated and would be doing something else in a better job market. Again, these companies don't actually do anything. Finally, there's advertising platforms like Facebook and Google. While these companies' bread and butter are very different, they both make the vast majority of their money from advertising, but more specifically, they're both in the business of hoovering up every bit of data they can about us in order to be able to predict our behavior so they can charge a premium when they show us hyper-targeted ads. But before we get more into that, I want to clarify and correct some misconceptions I see a lot. First of all, big data analysis was the buzzword du jour of the 2010s before it was replaced by AI. Every single company was bragging to investors about how they were going to revolutionize their field by collecting massive amounts of data from their users, which would allow them to profit in some completely unspecified way. A good example of this is Under Armour, which completely tanked as a company because the founder became obsessed with making fitness apps. The thing is that I think that the lesson people have taken from this is that actually these companies aren't profitable, the data are all useless, and this is all a big con. And in a lot of cases that is true, especially when you factor in the whole growth before profit model and you get companies like Uber who only just turned a profit for the first time in 2023 and also cannot stop catching strays in this video. That company literally can't do shit! With that said, when it comes to platforms, big data isn't just a buzzword. These companies all very literally run on data and they are very, very profitable as a result. What I'm describing here is what Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism, which she argues is a new permutation of capitalism where data became a resource to be extracted and then converted into value. I talk about this in more detail in my video about Too Hot to Handle, but as a quick catch-up, platforms, especially advertising ones, can best be understood as resource extraction companies. But rather than like oil or timber, the thing they extract is information about us. This is why their products and services are so cheap, if not free. Why is Meta's Quest several $100s cheaper than any other VR headset on the market? Why does Google give everyone 15 gigs of free cloud storage? Same reason ExxonMobil pays to build a new oil rig. One of the things that's so insidious about this too, though, is that when we talk about companies extracting value from our data, that isn't necessarily bad. And I don't just mean how, like, I'd rather get ads for things that I want than things that I don't. What I'm talking about is that while these companies make their money by using our data to target ads to us, they also use it to provide value for us, making their platforms better, which attracts more users. Like, I say this as someone whose default search engine is DuckDuckGo, and as shitty as Google's gotten lately, it's still way better than any of the alternatives that I've tried. Just writing and editing this video, whenever I need to track down a quote or find an image, it's genuinely night and day, and the reason for that is all the data that Google's collected. And I'm not bringing this up to say that mass surveillance is good actually, but instead to point out how dependent we are on it. I was talking to a friend of mine about this, and her take was that soon enough some other search engine that doesn't do this kind of stuff will come along and take over. The problem though is that any replacement to Google will still be running on data. This isn't a question of different business practices, but a different mode of production. As Zuboff writes, quote, demanding privacy from surveillance capitalists or lobbying for an end to commercial surveillance on the internet is like asking Henry Ford to make each Model T by hand. When it comes to surveillance capitalism, while other platforms like Facebook in particular give it a run for its money, Google is probably the worst, if for no other reason than the vast scale of its reach. One example of Google extracting data that I find particularly creepy is an old service they used to have called Goog 411, a name that sounds like a law firm jointly owned by a caveman and a robot. Basically, starting in 2007, before smartphones were widely adopted, Google had a number you could call that would use voice recognition to do basic searches for things like finding the number of a pizza place in your area. The service was discontinued in 2010, not because it wasn't being used anymore, but because it was full. The point of the service hadn't been to help people find pizza, it was to collect voices to train their speech recognition software, and once it had collected enough, it was discontinued. But now, let's pivot a bit to talk about Google and AI. Google is absolutely not the leader in this space. Their latest try at integrating AI into search told people to eat rocks and gasoline. I know, right? When will AI understand that those two flavors do not blend? But even still, they are relevant to AI and the future of the web in some pretty key ways, and I think that looking at those gives us some interesting insights into this whole thing. For one thing, Google was responsible for most people's first look into generative AI images back in 2015 with Google Deep Dream. For anyone who doesn't remember, pictures like this were what people thought of as AI back then. What you're seeing here was created by a neural net that was being trained to identify objects in a picture. Eventually, a researcher tried using the program on static, and it began finding images there like faces in a cloud. As it turns out, this looks trippy as hell, and so they started cranking the settings way up and getting it to overanalyze pictures to create images like this. Doing this got them a ton of great press, and I'm sure also allowed them to train their neural net on a way larger data set as people all over the world began messing around with the program. But it's kind of perfect then that images like this came to be called Google Deep Dreams, since if we ask what Google dreams about, the answer would be a world where every surface is covered in unblinking, lidless eyes. But Google has another, more adversarial relationship with AI as the owners of the leading CAPTCHA system, reCAPTCHA. First of all, let's get into how these CAPTCHAs work, because just like with Goog 411, Google doesn't do this out of the goodness of whatever horrifying machine they've installed where their heart should be. Whenever you solve a CAPTCHA, you're actually performing a piece of micro-labor for the company running the test, usually Google. For example, with these now obsolete letter tests, each of these letters came from a scanned book that Google Books was having trouble transcribing. When you're shown street numbers or asked to identify a crosswalk or traffic light, that's being used to train Google Maps. Google keeps a lot of what they look for with the current version secret for security reasons, but the things that we know it checks are mouse movements when you go to click the box, as well as cookies. That's why you get shown them a lot if you use a VPN. Also, a little tip is that you can generally get through them faster if you shake your mouse around before clicking the box. Anyway, you're gonna be shocked to hear this, but they also use your cookies for targeted ads. But there's also something deeply interesting about what CAPTCHA is on a fundamental level. I mentioned this in my video about the history of spam, but for anyone who doesn't know, CAPTCHA is a sort of reverse Turing test. Literally, even the word is a wonky acronym for a completely automated public Turing test to tell computers and humans apart. In Alan Turing's famous test, he proposed a sort of parlor game where a man and a woman are kept in separate rooms and each write letters to a judge who has to guess which is which. Turing proposed playing the same game but with a human and a computer, and claimed that the computer could be said to be intelligent if it could fool the judge. Now, regardless of what you might think about the validity of Turing's test, just think about how fundamentally human it is. Like, how do you know if a machine has human intelligence? Why, invite it to play a game with you, of course. What kind of game? Well, one that involves imitation, communication, deception, playing with identity. The original game even involved playing with gender. As Roy Batty said, shape-shifting is, after all, inherent to human consciousness. Now, let's compare that to the reverse Turing test being done by CAPTCHAs. I think it says something about companies like Google's priorities that while the original human-run Turing test measured intelligence by playing a game, these machine-run tests measure if you're able to complete a monotonous task. While Turing was interested in machines being made to be more human, CAPTCHA instead wants humans to be more mechanical. We can actually see the most extreme version of this in the services used by spammers to get around CAPTCHAs. Most of them are automated and have success rates in the low double digits, but the high-end ones literally just pay people, usually in poor countries, to sit at a computer and solve CAPTCHAs all day. I mentioned this in my spam video, saying that these people are effectively being paid to be human, but looking back, are they really? I personally don't think I could imagine a less human, more soul-sucking job. In fact, if anything, it feels more like they're being paid to be machines. Now, something else is that CAPTCHA isn't unique in how it operates. Just about every piece of internet infrastructure comes from an aggregation of the same kind of micro-labor being harnessed and used for some other purpose. Going all the way back to the initial key to Google's success, what made searching so good was that while other sites ranked searches based on how often a searched word appeared on a page, Google's PageRank algorithm instead weighed sites based on reputation by factoring in how many sites linked to a certain page. Just like CAPTCHA, this meant utilizing the aggregate labor of everyone who made those sites. And this, to me, is the crux of what pisses me off about CAPTCHA, about Google search, and about AI. It's not a feeling of plagiarism or surveillance, but theft. By solving CAPTCHAs, we've transcribed millions of books, and rather than getting access to them, they're paywalled and we're treated to a new bot filter that's collecting our data so it can show us ads for the vacuum cleaner I just bought last fucking week. With social media, it'd be one thing if they were just harvesting our data in exchange for letting us keep in touch with people, but I can't even see that a friend from university got engaged through all the articles that make me furious and ads for fake mobile games. Anytime I make a purchase now, rather than Googling it, I have to spend hours sifting through subreddits and forums to find websites that specialize in the one singular thing that I need, because of course the air purifier site doesn't talk about air conditioners, but even after being shown probably thousands of ads and sponsored posts, as well as clicking through dozens of links to these niche sites, Google still will only show me Forbes, Rolling Stone, and the New York Times. This is what's so viscerally infuriating to me about surveillance capitalism. Like, we aren't customers. Google's customers are its advertisers. We are a resource, and so aren't even entitled to the dignity of just an exchange. And then there's AI. First of all, I should probably lay out where I stand, which is, for one thing, I'm sorry to say, but I think that shaming companies that use it on Twitter is going to become less and less effective as the technology gets better and more normalized. I'm firmly of the opinion that AI is going to become the norm to the point that fucked up hands and teeth from early models will eventually come to replace VHS distortion as the go-to retro aesthetic. Now, obviously, I think that everyone should be able to control if their work or image is being trained off of, like, as a privacy issue and a matter of artists being compensated. But honestly, beyond that, I don't really care about the whole plagiarism thing that much. Because, like, To me, it just seems so optimistic to think that this stuff is going to be used to make art instead of, spreading conspiracy theories and scamming our parents. I'm not putting it in a video or consuming it as actual art, but I've absolutely fucked around with AI and, used it to make a song that I've sent to my friends where the White Stripes explain to them in song that I'm running late because I took a huge shit. And I'll do it again. And don't get me wrong, I definitely support things like the writer's strike fighting for job security, as well as artists using tools like Nightshade and Glaze, filters that apply nearly imperceptible changes to art in order to make them unrecognizable to AI in an effort to poison the data set that they're training on. Link to both in the description, by the way. Now, I say all this not just as a matter of wanting to hold back technology. A lot of the limitations inherent to AI mean that AI art will necessarily be worse in some very important ways. In the case of replacing actors, generative images and videos can't be tweaked and reworked according to notes. It has to remake the entire thing instead, putting some pretty huge limitations on what it can actually be used for. Likewise for writers, AI can genuinely do things like, for example, write an email to schedule a meeting or something like that. But when it comes to being creative, what LLMs produce is inherently average. Literally, it is the average of what it has been trained on. Since they fundamentally can't make something exceptional, I find it kind of hard to imagine books or movies written by AI having that much of an appeal. And these aren't just things that we can expect to get better with time the same way that they can make hands now, but fundamental limitations of how the technology works. I'm not saying that something that could do all these things couldn't ever be made, but that is fully a different technology. And the thing is that the major companies pushing this know all of that. What AI being injected into the creative process will likely actually involve will be using it to generate something extremely mediocre and then paying people to turn it into something good for much less than they would have previously been paid, since their job is no longer writing or illustrating, but managing AI. In a talk by Maggie Appleton, who's one of the few people I've found who's actually knowledgeable about this stuff and isn't a grifter, she lists a number of possible outcomes for how AI could change the world. One is that as LLMs become commonly adapted, we can expect them to, as she puts it, raise the floor and the ceiling. Essentially, they'll help people who are currently making extremely high or low quality work. For simplicity's sake, we'll just use the example of writing, where today we see people putting out lower quality work because they struggle with certain disabilities, as well as writing in a second language. We could realistically expect to see AI services in the next few years that will significantly help with breaking down those barriers, which I do genuinely think is really cool. And then when it comes to people who already write amazingly, we could expect to see that getting even better as they find creative ways to incorporate AI that improve rather than replace their normal process. Things like having it Socratically question them to flesh out ideas. There's also just stuff that computers will always be better at than humans, like searching massive archives. Imagine if search engines could not only find information for you, but also put it into a spreadsheet and do basic analysis too. Honestly, right now I'd be pretty stoked if search engines could just find things in the first place, but I digress. The problem though is what will happen to people in the middle, which if I just pull up a diagram here of a normal distribution, yeah, that's probably us. If the middle becomes the floor, then people in the middle, also known in statistics as most of us, are kinda screwed. Appleton argues that one of the issues with this will be that a lot of people who are currently slightly above average will get pulled down as they increasingly offload more and more of their work to AIs, resulting in generic and predictable work. Luckily for me though, a lot of the YouTubers I see are already making stuff like that without AI, so the change might not be too noticeable. Another potential outcome is what she refers to as human centipede epistemology. What this means is that if we start treating these models as reliable sources of truth, we're gonna be completely cooked. This isn't just about people believing Google when it tells you that sewing your mouth to someone's anus is a great way to lose weight though. One of the inherent limitations of these models is that they don't exist in the material world, meaning that they can only access reality secondhand through what they're trained on, i.e., everything that they know just comes from what people, in a sense, told them. For Appleton, this becomes a problem when we start looking to them as sources of truth, since that means that we're relying on information that has no direct basis in reality. This becomes a vicious cycle when people who are informed by LLMs go on to produce work that's used to train them, making things even more detached than before, effectively ending any shared objective reality. Human centipede epistemology. Appleton proposes some solutions to all of this. One is for AI developers to center human agency as much as possible. Basically, when a ton of complicated tasks are given to an AI while a human sits back and doesn't do anything is where things can get bad quickly. Instead, we should focus on creating a more collaborative process. Building off of that first suggestion, AI should augment our cognitive abilities, not replace them. As I mentioned earlier, there are certain things that machines are straight up better than humans at doing, and vice versa. And so rather than just having an AI do all of the work for us, instead we should focus on delegating certain tasks that improve areas where we're not that good, and doing all the stuff that we are better at instead. And finally, we should treat these models as reasoning agents rather than sources of truth. Now, I agree with all of these points, and I think that that would be very helpful, but also, this is kind of where everything I've read on AI tends to lose me, since no one who talks about this includes any arguments about why implementing these changes would be in any way profitable in the next year or so, which I'd love to be proven wrong here, but I'm pretty sure that means that none of this will amount to much more than like some fancy advertising buzzwords. In terms of what we can actually do, like I said earlier, I'm not particularly optimistic. With that said, I don't think that we need to necessarily proclaim it over just yet. For one thing, as Appleton points out, one likely outcome is that as AI takes over the web, we'll start seeing the rise of filters that can remove most, if not all, of the spam. While this will still present a massive problem on the back end, I think it's likely that the average internet user won't have to deal with this too much. If this happens, viewing pages without these filters might come to be seen as like akin to surfing the dark web. It's also worth noting, though, that the bots don't have to be bad. As Robert Mariani notes in his paper, The Dead Internet to Come, the co-founder of Reddit, Steve Hoffman, has admitted that when the site started, they flooded it with bots and sock puppet accounts to fake activity and encourage posting. The thing is that people didn't mind this because the fake accounts were actually posting good stuff. There is a world where the internet doesn't die per se, but changes, losing most if not all of its homemade charm, but gaining extremely effective bots that allow all sorts of things that we can't even imagine today. But also, I'm not totally convinced that we should expect the real human-made internet to disappear, but instead to go underground. Yancey Strickler coined the term the dark forest theory of the internet, a reference to Liu Cixin's three-body problem trilogy that proposes a solution to the Fermi paradox, the question of why, if there's intelligent life in the universe, have we not seen any. Cixin proposes an answer using the analogy of a dark forest. If you find yourself in a forest in the dead of night when nothing's moving and everything's quiet, you might assume that it's empty, but no, the animals aren't gone. They're hiding from predators. Now, I'm not really going to get into this question as it relates to aliens, but if you're interested in learning more about it, Dr. Fatima made a great video about it that you should definitely check out. But Strickler argues that, like the creatures in the forest, the internet, both now and increasingly in the future, isn't dead, but hiding. And I think that this is maybe a good starting point. Like, it's at least something that we can do right now. Get off the open web and find communities. Ideally do this in the real world, but also online. Sorry, I realize how treacly and naive all of that sounds, or maybe I'm just hanging out with JReg too much. But lame or not, the advice still stands. These platforms are already terrible places to find community, and that's only going to get worse. Also though, it's interesting how this approach has a lot of similarities to one of the problems it's trying to solve: spam. In his book, Spam, The Shadow History of the Internet, Finn Brunton argues that spam exists in the gray area between what a platform is meant to be used for and what it lets you get away with doing. And while that describes like social media growth hacking, it also describes a finsta. But let's come back to complaining a bit while we wrap up here. One of the things that Mariani argues in his paper is that while filters like CAPTCHA will eventually fail to prevent the flood of bots, they buy us precious time to prepare. The thing I wonder though is if the floodgates will open because the filters eventually fail or because they'll have served their purpose. What will happen when CAPTCHA, like Goog 411, has outlived its usefulness as a tool for data extraction? Will the bots be too good, or will Google no longer see value in stopping them? I don't think that I'm particularly against new technology by any stretch. There's lots of AI tools that I think look awesome and could be extremely useful, but when I see the biggest proponents of this technology gleefully speculating that movies will soon be completely artificially generated, I have to wonder why they want this. Is culture war hatred of liberal celebrities really a good justification for building a pleasure dystopia? To me, while I take all these things seriously, the threat of AI goes beyond spam, beyond plagiarism, and beyond workers' rights. As genuinely exciting as this technology often is, the people who make it have made it clear that what they'd like most is to reduce humans to programmable automatons. We can see this in Zuckerberg's search for the fundamental law of human interaction, or with Google's research director Peter Norvig, who in 2008 claimed that thanks to Google's massive database, quote, all models are wrong and increasingly you can succeed without them. Adding that with petabytes of data at their disposal, it's no longer true that correlation doesn't equal causation. For Google, quote, correlation is enough. Already, AI companies are running out of training data, with some even suggesting that people who wind up becoming unemployed thanks to AI should be put to work creating new training data. At which point, it starts to become harder to argue that all of this is really meant to make the world better. None of my issues are with the technology of AI, but instead with the people making it who are trying to make computers more human-like in order to make humans more computer-like. Thanks for watching.